Clara Baines stepped through the heavy glass doors of Harper's, a refined restaurant tucked away on a quiet side street in Savannah, Georgia. It was a bright Thursday afternoon, and the heat of the summer sun hung thick in the air. Clara, elegant and composed, moved through the lobby with a grace that defied her age. Her powder blue dress flowed softly around her knees, and the quiet tap of her low-heeled shoes echoed gently against the polished floor. In her hand, she held a worn brown fedora, her late husband's favorite, pressed carefully against her chest. Her silver hair, pinned neatly at the back of her head, gleamed in the sunlight, and for a moment, she paused just inside the door, letting her eyes adjust to the dimmer lighting. The room, nearly half empty, buzzed with the quiet hum of waiters in crisp shirts and ties moving from table to table, delivering food with the precision of professionals. But as Clara looked around, she didn't see the polished silver or the crisp white linen. She saw memories. Memories of a time when her late husband, Walter, would have loved this place. Walter had always said, "Treat yourself like you matter, because you do, Clara." She smiled softly at the thought, a small but genuine curve of her lips. This was a place Walter would have enjoyed, not for the extravagance or the polished environment, but for its quiet sophistication. She stood a little taller, her back straight, shoulders squared, a woman who had lived and loved through more than most could ever understand. Yet, as Clara made her way toward the hostess stand, a shift in the atmosphere was palpable. The air felt heavier. The waiters continued their meticulous work, but there was an undeniable tension building around her. It wasn't that they were openly rude, it was something subtler. A quiet judgment in the air, an unspoken assessment. And then Jeremy Landon, the young waiter behind the stand, noticed her. Jeremy was young, no older than 25, with sandy blonde hair slicked back too tightly, giving him a look that seemed both forced and insincere. He sized Clara up the moment she entered. The old dress, the scuffed shoes, the way she clutched that old hat. In his mind, she didn't belong here. He glanced at her briefly, and without offering a smile or a greeting, he coolly informed her, "We're full today. Private event." "Sorry." The words hit Clara like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She had been through enough in her life to know better than to be rattled by such a thinly veiled insult. The restaurant around her continued, but Clara noticed the truth beneath Jeremy's words. The tables were nearly empty. For empty spots by the windows, 2 more at the back. The lie hung thick in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Still, Clara didn't let the insult show. Instead, she stood there, her presence steady and unyielding, waiting for something more than just an apology. She was waiting for acknowledgement. Clara stood there, still and steady, her hand gently clutching her late husband's fedora. The air around her was thick, not just with the heat of a Savannah afternoon, but with something far more suffocating. The palpable tension of being unseen. It was a quiet kind of injustice, the sort that stung not with loud words, but with the cold indifference of being ignored. Jeremy's eyes darted briefly to the register, pretending to check something on his tablet, clearly trying to dismiss her. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but as I said, we're full. Private event," he repeated, his tone even colder than before. Clara took a slow breath, the kind of deep, measured inhale someone might take before a storm. She didn't let the tightness in her chest show, nor the way her fingers tightened imperceptibly around the brim of Walter's hat. She didn't let the hurt, that quiet whisper of judgment from the young man, crack her resolve. This wasn't the first time she had been dismissed because of her age, or the color of her skin, or the way others presumed her to be less than she was. She had lived through too many moments like this to let one more destroy her spirit. Her voice, when she spoke, was warm, soft, utterly unshaken. I'm quite sure I have a reservation. My son made it. His name is Calvin Baines. There's a luncheon here today, and I was invited. Jeremy's gaze flicked over her face, but he didn't meet her eyes. His fingers hovered over the tablet, his face pinched with a disinterested smirk. I'm sorry, ma'am, he said, his voice hollow, barely looking at her as he continued. Reservations only, and I'm afraid it's all booked. Clara's gaze didn't waver. She didn't break eye contact, not even when the sound of silverware clinking on plates filled the room, the distant murmur of diners talking among themselves. She was waiting for him to recognize that this wasn't just about a seat at a restaurant. This was about something much bigger. Respect, dignity, acknowledgement. Are you sure? She asked again, her voice barely more than a whisper, but somehow carrying across the room. She glanced around the restaurant, her eyes carefully sweeping over the empty tables. 4 by the windows, 2 at the back wall. She knew what she was seeing. She could feel the weight of the lie hanging in the air. Clara's calm wasn't about being passive. It was about knowing her worth in the face of disdain. She had learned long ago that silence was a powerful tool, one that often spoke louder than words. But Jeremy wasn't done. He glanced up briefly, his eyes meeting hers for just a moment, then turned away. The smile he offered wasn't sincere. In fact, it barely passed for an attempt at politeness. Maybe you should try somewhere else, he suggested, his voice rising just enough for the nearby diners to hear. There are other places, you know? Clara stood her ground, but a knot of anger began to form deep inside. Not for herself, she had learned long ago not to expect much from the world, but for the people who had ignored her, the people who had seen what was happening but hadn't said a word. The diners, with their half-emptied glasses of wine and plates of food, hadn't so much as glanced her way. Not one of them spoke up. It was the silence that made Clara's chest tighten, that made the air feel heavier than it ever had. She could feel their eyes on her, some with a glint of curiosity, others with a hint of discomfort, and still others with indifference. They didn't want to be involved. Not in this. She was nothing more than a spectacle, something to glance at briefly and then look away from. And yet, Clara remained unfazed, her back still straight, her shoulders squared. She wasn't going to let them have the satisfaction of watching her leave, not when she knew they were wrong. But something was shifting in the restaurant. The whispers between the other diners grew quieter. A voice from the bar suddenly spoke out, cutting through the hushed tension. "Hey, man!" A man in his 30s called, his tone uncertain. "She says she has an invitation. Maybe you should check again." Jeremy glanced toward the bar but didn't acknowledge the voice. Clara could see the flicker of discomfort in the man's eyes as he tried to decide whether to intervene or not. He didn't want to risk getting involved. He was a guest, just like everyone else here, and who wanted to upset the status quo? Clara pressed her hand tighter against the fedora. She could feel the eyes of the room on her now, the weight of their collective inaction. The longer she stood there, the more the silence grew oppressive, wrapping itself around her like a suffocating blanket. She took a deep breath, her voice once again a soft murmur in the sea of tension. "I'll wait here," she said calmly, as if asking for nothing more than a seat. But in truth, asking for much more than that. She wasn't just waiting for a table. She was waiting for recognition, waiting for someone to stand up, to speak out, to challenge the injustice that was being handed to her. Jeremy didn't acknowledge her request. Instead, he walked away without a word, disappearing into the kitchen. His steps were fast, deliberately avoiding any further confrontation, as though the issue was beneath him. The restaurant was quiet. Clara remained standing at the hostess stand, her gaze fixed on the door, waiting. She felt the heat creeping up her neck, not from embarrassment, but from a quiet, simmering anger. Anger that had been building for years, anger that she had carried with her through decades of silent battles, small insults, and quiet degradations. But she wasn't going to let this moment define her. Not this time. Around her, the diners remained silent, their discomfort palpable, yet still no one spoke out. It was the kind of silence that weighed more than any words could ever do, the kind that allowed injustice to stand unchallenged. And then, just as it seemed as though the world might move on without her, the door creaked open. The bell above it rang, and Clara's son, Calvin Baines, walked in. The minutes stretched long as Clara stood there, still as a statue, her back straight, her fingers tight around the brim of Walter's hat. Her eyes never wavered from the door, a silent, unspoken challenge hanging in the air. She wasn't just waiting for her son. She was waiting for a moment, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice the injustice that had been silently unfolding around her. The room hummed with the clatter of silverware and the murmurs of voices, but Clara's world was a bubble of quiet tension, an unbearable stillness, broken only by the soft thud of her shoes on the marble floor as she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her thoughts were distant, but they were steady. She wasn't worried, not for herself. She had faced much worse in her life. No, her heart ached for the world around her. This world that had yet to understand what it meant to truly see a person. Then, just as her patience began to bend, the door creaked open. It wasn't the jarring noise of another customer entering. It wasn't the shuffle of footsteps or the casual murmur of another diner. No, this was different. This was a moment, an answer to a prayer she had never voiced. The bell above the door rang as a man stepped inside, tall and confident, his tailored gray suit moving effortlessly with every step. His presence was unmistakable, and his stride commanded attention. Calvin Baines had arrived. The second he walked through that door, everything in the room seemed to shift. Clara's eyes locked on her son, and for the first time since she had walked into this establishment, her gaze softened and a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips. Her son had always had that effect on her. A reminder that, in a world full of coldness, there was someone who understood her completely. Calvin was in his late 40s, a successful man who commanded attention without even trying. His sharp, confident eyes scanned the room, and as soon as he saw his mother standing by the hostess stand, a flicker of recognition crossed his face. But then his gaze shifted, landing on Jeremy, who was still standing there, pretending to fiddle with the tablet, pretending not to notice the tension that hung between them. Jeremy, for his part, didn't seem to know what to do. He quickly looked away, but Calvin's presence was impossible to ignore. The other diners, who had been avoiding the situation, now couldn't help but watch as Calvin approached with a quiet certainty. His every step measured, deliberate, powerful. Calvin didn't glance at the tables, or at the manager, or at the other diners who were all too eager to look away. No, his eyes stayed fixed on Jeremy. There was no need for words. His mere presence was enough to make the air in the room grow thick with anticipation. "Is there a problem here?" Calvin's voice was calm, but it carried an authority that sent a ripple of unease through the room. His eyes didn't leave Jeremy's face as he approached the young waiter, who was now visibly uncomfortable, fidgeting with his tablet as though it might somehow offer him an escape. Jeremy stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporating. I told her we're full, sir. It's a private event, only by reservation." Calvin didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply met Jeremy's gaze with a look that was as sharp as it was unyielding. "My mother, Clara Baines, has a reservation, and, with all due respect, I think you should have known that before deciding to turn her away." The words hung in the air like a challenge, heavy and full of meaning. For a moment, Jeremy's face flickered between guilt and confusion, a sharp contrast to the arrogance he had worn earlier. But Calvin wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his voice low but carrying a quiet strength. "You don't recognize her name, do you?" Calvin's question wasn't rhetorical. It was pointed. "Let me make it clear for you. Clara Baines is one of the first black female judges in this state. She fought for the rights that many take for granted. She opened doors for people like you, people who now sit here, too afraid to speak up when they see injustice unfolding before their eyes." The room fell deathly silent. Clara, standing just a few steps away, felt a wave of pride surge through her chest. It wasn't the pride of a mother watching her son defend her. It was the pride of a woman who had lived a life filled with quiet, difficult victories. A life that had made this moment possible. As Calvin spoke, Jeremy's face turned pale. The room seemed to grow smaller, the weight of his realization pressing down on him with suffocating force. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Yes, sir," he stammered, his voice trembling. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Baines. I had no idea. His words trailed off into silence, and he quickly turned to the computer screen, tapping at the tablet in a desperate attempt to redeem himself. "Right this way," Jeremy said, his voice barely audible as he stuttered, trying to usher them to a table. But the damage was done. Clara and Calvin exchanged a brief, knowing glance. They didn't need the apology. They didn't need the table. What they needed was something more. A reckoning. Calvin stood still, not moving, his gaze never leaving Jeremy's face. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years of injustice. "You didn't see her when she walked in," he said, his words deliberate, each one falling like a stone into the silence. "You didn't see a woman with a history. You saw a woman you thought didn't belong. But the truth is, you were wrong. And it's important you know that." The room, filled with hushed whispers and quick glances, seemed to hold its breath. The diners, who had watched in silence, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some turned away, unable to meet Clara's steady gaze. Others looked between her and Calvin, the weight of the moment sinking in. But Clara, ever graceful, never looked back at them. She simply nodded at her son, a quiet acknowledgement of the battle they had fought and won, without ever raising a hand. Calvin gave her a small, proud smile, and as they walked toward the table that had been hastily prepared for them, Clara knew that, in some small way, the world had just shifted. The moment Clara and Calvin walked toward the reserved table, the room's atmosphere shifted from awkwardness to tension. The silence that followed their exchange with Jeremy seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on everyone in the restaurant. The whispers that had started earlier, when the confrontation had first begun, now grew louder as people looked around, unsure of how to act, uncertain of what to say. And then, just as they were about to sit, Calvin turned. The words were slow, deliberate, but there was an unmistakable edge to his voice, one that made the diners stop mid-conversation, one that made their eyes snap to him in an instant. "My mother," he began, his voice cutting through the thick tension, "is Clara Baines. She is one of the first black female judges in this state." He paused, letting his words settle. "And you should know that she's the reason some of the rights you all take for granted are even possible. She fought for justice, for equality, for you." His words were quiet but carried a weight that demanded attention. Every head turned, every fork paused midair, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. The air in the restaurant felt thick, suffocating. What had once been a place of comfort, of quiet lunch conversations and clinking glasses, was now a stage for something far deeper, far more important than anyone could have expected. Clara's legacy, her years of work, her sacrifices. All of it now stood in stark contrast to the indifference she had faced only moments ago. Calvin's voice didn't rise in anger. It didn't demand their sympathy, but it commanded respect as he calmly added, "You didn't see her when she walked in. You didn't see the history, the legacy she carries. You saw someone you thought didn't belong here. But I hope you all understand now that you were wrong." The room was still. The weight of his words lingered in the air like a thick fog, suffocating the space. Not one person spoke. Not one person moved. Clara, standing just behind her son, felt the surge of pride deep in her chest. But her expression didn't change. She didn't need to speak. She had said all that needed to be said long ago, through actions, through choices, through the years she had spent fighting the battles that had shaped the world around her. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something that needed to be flaunted or boasted. It was something that could simply be worn, like armor, a quiet strength that could withstand even the sharpest jabs of prejudice. And so, with quiet dignity, she let her son's words hang in the air. She didn't seek validation from the room. She didn't need applause. She had done what she had come to do, not to prove anything to anyone, but to hold her head high in a world that had often tried to tear her down. And now, as the room fell silent, Clara could feel the weight of their discomfort, the guilt, the shame. The private ceremony, where Clara was to be honored, began shortly after. The room was much smaller now. A select group of colleagues, local officials, and others who had known Clara and her work for years. The buzz of the restaurant faded as Clara stepped into the private space, a space that now felt safer, warmer. It was a place where she could finally exhale. The event was meant to celebrate her legacy, her contributions to the community. A banner stretched across the far wall with her name emblazoned in bold letters. There were framed photos, a table with flowers, a microphone set up at the front. The kind of ceremony that could make anyone feel like a star. But Clara wasn't a star. She was a fighter, a warrior, if you will. She was a woman who had spent decades in the trenches, who had fought tirelessly for justice, not for accolades, but because it was the right thing to do. She had spent years in courtrooms, arguing cases that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. She had mentored countless young lawyers, breaking down barriers so they could stand where she had stood. And yet, as she looked around the room, surrounded by familiar faces, she felt no need to speak of the painful moments that had led her here. The rejection, the isolation, the nights she had spent sitting in empty rooms, waiting for a seat at the table that was never offered. Clara had never been one to wear her pain as a badge. She had long ago learned that some stories were too heavy to share, too raw to lay bare in front of others. The moments of racism she had endured, the doors slammed in her face, the quiet dismissals, all of it had built a quiet strength inside her. And now, standing in this room, she realized that she didn't need to tell anyone about those experiences. They were part of her, woven into the very fabric of who she was. The people who needed to understand, who needed to learn, would do so through their own actions, through their own realizations. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was enough. It had always been enough as the ceremony progressed. Clara stood at the front, nodding politely as colleagues and officials spoke of her accomplishments. They recounted the history, the court cases, the doors she had kicked open. They spoke of the trail she had blazed for women and minorities in the legal profession. But none of them knew the full story. None of them knew the weight she had carried, the quiet battles that had never made it into the headlines. But Clara didn't need them to know. What mattered now was that they recognized her for who she truly was. Not just a judge, not just an advocate for justice, but a woman who had lived through 1,000 quiet struggles and still stood tall at the end of the ceremony. As the applause filled the room, Clara remained composed, smiling softly. She wasn't here for the recognition. She wasn't here for the accolades. She had already done the work. She had already proven herself. The real test, she knew, wasn't in the speeches or the applause. It was in how people treated each other when no one was watching. It was in the small, everyday moments where the world either chose to see or chose to look away. As she stepped away from the ceremony, Clara didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had already won. After the ceremony had ended, Clara sat quietly by the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The sound of clinking silverware, muffled conversations, and soft laughter floated in from the other room. But in this moment, Clara was far removed from it all. She stared out the window at the fading light of the afternoon, the golden sun casting long shadows over the city streets. Her thoughts were as still as the room around her, yet in her mind memories stirred, memories of battles fought, of doors slammed in her face, of silent moments in crowded spaces where she had felt invisible. She had spent so many years trying to carve out a space for herself, to make the world see her for who she truly was. And yet, moments like today, the indignities, the small wounds of rejection, reminded her of how much further there still was to go. Beside her, Calvin sat with a quiet presence. He hadn't said much during the ceremony, but he'd watched his mother, his eyes never leaving her face, as though trying to drink in every ounce of the wisdom that had shaped her. Now, as they sat together, he shifted slightly in his seat, his voice breaking the silence. "You were incredible, Mama," he said, his words filled with pride. "The way you held yourself. You didn't even raise your voice, yet you made everyone in that room see you. See us." Clara smiled softly, but the smile was more resigned than triumphant. She didn't need the recognition. She hadn't fought for applause or for anyone's admiration. She had fought for the truth, for dignity, and for the belief that no one should ever be made to feel small, no matter their age, color, or history. "Calvin," she began, her voice low but steady, "what you saw today, that wasn't for anyone else. That was for me, for the woman I've had to become in order to survive. I didn't need their approval. I just needed to stand tall no matter what anyone else said or thought. You can't control what others do or say, but you can control how you respond." She turned her gaze to the window, her eyes tracing the patterns of the light as it played off the glass. "You know, I've fought for so many things in my life. Justice, equality, a seat at the table. But the hardest fight, the one I've fought every single day, has been against bitterness. Against letting what others think of me become who I am. I learned long ago that bitterness can destroy you from the inside out." Calvin listened intently, sensing that his mother was about to reveal something deeper, something far more personal than the stories of her legal victories or her public life. "It's easy to become angry, Calvin," Clara continued, her voice quieter now, as if speaking to herself as much as to her son. "It's easy to let the hurt pile up, to let it fester, to let it harden your heart. But when you let anger take over, it controls you. It steals your peace, your dignity, your ability to move forward. And that's something I've never been willing to lose." She paused for a moment, the weight of her words settling in the quiet space between them. Calvin didn't speak. He just watched her, his gaze soft but unwavering. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, Calvin," Clara went on, her voice gentle but firm. "It means choosing not to let the pain define you. It means refusing to let what others do to you steal your joy, your grace, your ability to move forward with your head held high. Sometimes, forgiveness is the hardest thing we can do, but it's also the thing that keeps us from becoming who they think we are. It's the thing that protects our dignity, our humanity." Calvin's brow furrowed as he thought about her words. "But Mama," he said, his voice hesitant, "what about people like Jeremy? What about people who choose to hurt others, who choose to see someone as less than they are? How do you forgive that?" Clara sighed, a small, quiet sound that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime's worth of wisdom. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing their behavior, Calvin. It's not about saying what they did is okay. It's about freeing yourself from the grip of hatred. It's about not letting their choices control your happiness. Yes, people will hurt you. Yes, they will disappoint you. But you can't let that consume you. If you do, then you've allowed them to win. You've given them power over you." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze locking with her son's. "Forgiveness is not for them, Calvin. It's for you. It's for your peace of mind. It's for your heart so it doesn't turn into something you don't want it to be. You don't forgive for their sake. You forgive so that you can keep moving forward, so that you don't carry the weight of their cruelty with you. And sometimes, that's the only thing you can do to preserve your dignity." Calvin's eyes softened, understanding the depth of his mother's words. He had always known her to be strong, unyielding in her pursuit of justice. But now, as he sat beside her, he saw another side of her. A side that had learned, through years of struggle, that true strength wasn't just in fighting back. It was in choosing to rise above the hate, to refuse to let the bitterness of the world shape who you were. I've carried a lot of anger in my life, Clara said, almost as if speaking to herself. A lot of pain, and there were times I thought I couldn't let it go. But I've learned that you can't carry it forever. You can't let it define you. If you do, you're just carrying their burden, not your own. And it's a burden you were never meant to carry. The room fell into silence again, but this time, it was a quiet that was full of understanding. Clara's words lingered between them, heavy and beautiful, like a final piece of a puzzle that had finally clicked into place. Calvin didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, he knew one thing for sure. His mother had shown him that strength wasn't about never feeling pain. It was about choosing how to rise above it, and with that, as the afternoon sun slowly dipped lower, they sat together in the quiet, the weight of their conversation settling between them like a shared secret, a lesson passed down through generations. As the last of the ceremony's guests began to filter out of the private room, Clara and Calvin sat quietly at the head of the table, the weight of the day's events lingering in the air like smoke after a storm. The room had been filled with admiration and praise, but Clara knew, deep in her heart, that none of it had changed the truth she had lived for so many years, that the fight for respect and dignity was not won in grand speeches or awards, but in the quiet, everyday choices to rise above the slights and wounds of the world. She glanced at her son, who sat beside her, his gaze far away, his brow furrowed as he seemed to process everything that had happened. She had watched him through the ceremony, his proud, protective nature wrapped around her like a shield. But now, as the clinking of silverware and low murmur of conversations drifted in from the other room, she could feel the tension in him, his sense of justice, his need to make things right. "Are you okay, Mama?" Calvin asked, his voice softer now, as if searching for something beneath the surface of his mother's calm. Clara smiled faintly, her eyes holding his. "I'm all right, baby. I've been all right for a long time." She let her words settle, allowing a moment of silence to pass between them. "But I'm proud of you, proud of how you spoke up today." Calvin shifted in his chair, his gaze softening as he met her eyes. "You didn't have to carry all that pain alone, you know? I could have done more. I should have stepped in sooner." Clara reached out and placed a hand on his, her fingers gentle but firm. "You've done more than enough, Calvin. You've always been there when I needed you. But this fight, it's not yours to fight, at least not in the way you think. I've walked this road for a long time, and it's one I've had to learn to walk with grace, with dignity, and with the strength to let things go, even when the world tries to drag me down." Calvin looked at his mother, his heart heavy with a mixture of pride and sadness. He knew that what she was saying was true. She had endured so much in silence, her struggles invisible to many. But today, in that restaurant, it had all been laid bare. He had seen his mother not just as the strong figure he had always admired, but as a woman who had fought 1,000 battles without ever asking for recognition, a woman who had quietly carried the weight of history on her shoulders. But just as the weight of the day seemed to settle over them, a familiar voice broke the stillness. "Excuse me, ma'am." Clara's gaze flicked toward the door, where Jeremy stood, looking uncertain, his shoulders stiff. He was no longer in his crisp uniform, but in the casual attire he had worn after his shift. His face was flushed, his posture rigid, but his eyes were filled with something Clara had not expected: shame. Clara met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm but alert. There was a brief moment of silence, the air thick with the lingering echoes of everything that had happened earlier. The dismissal, the lie, the subtle rejection. I just wanted to apologize, ma'am," Jeremy stammered, his voice shaky, "for how I treated you earlier. I know I was wrong, and I shouldn't have judged you like that. You didn't deserve it. I was rude, and I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and uncertain. For a moment, Clara simply looked at him, her gaze steady and unwavering. She saw the young man standing before her, nervous, uncomfortable in the silence that stretched between them. She knew that he had likely never been confronted with the consequences of his actions like this. His world had been simple, his judgments made on the surface, without ever understanding the weight that each of his words could carry. But Clara did not respond immediately. She felt no anger, no need for a dramatic confrontation. The years of fighting had taught her something that words could never teach. The true measure of strength was in how you chose to rise above the negativity, how you chose to let go of the things that threatened to consume you. Finally, after a long pause, Clara simply nodded, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you." Her words were simple, but in them was everything she needed to say. There was no lecture, no grand speech about the injustices she had faced, no rebuke for the way he had treated her, just a quiet acknowledgement that he had made an effort to correct his mistake. Calvin, standing behind his mother, watched this exchange with a mix of surprise and admiration. He had expected his mother to say more. After all, she had every right to. But Clara didn't need to say anything more. She didn't need the apology to feel vindicated. She didn't need the world to acknowledge her in the way he thought she did. What she needed, what she had always needed, was to maintain her own sense of peace, to remain steadfast in her dignity, even when others tried to strip it away. Jeremy stood there for a moment longer, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of Clara's gaze. He opened his mouth as if to say something more, but Clara's calm demeanor seemed to make him think better of it. With a quick nod, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing softly in the distance. Clara watched him go, her expression unreadable. Then, without another word, she turned to Calvin. "Let's go, baby," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to leave this behind." As they stood up, Clara felt the weight of the day lift from her shoulders, the remnants of the tension and discomfort dissipating with each step they took toward the door. She had faced the harshness of the world once again, but she had chosen peace. She had chosen forgiveness. Not for Jeremy's sake, but for her own. She stepped outside, the cool evening air brushing against her skin, and with each breath, she felt a quiet victory settle in her chest. The world would continue to turn, and the fight for dignity would never end. But in this moment, Clara Baines was free, free from anger, free from bitterness, and free to walk forward with her head held high, knowing that she had chosen the path that mattered most. And as Calvin followed her out, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of awe, not just for his mother's strength, but for her ability to forgive, to rise above the world's harshness without ever losing the beauty of her heart. Clara had shown him the truest form of strength, and in doing so, she had set herself, and him, free as Clara and Calvin drove home through the quiet streets of Savannah, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the old brick buildings. A sense of calm settled in the car. The earlier tension, the confrontation at the restaurant, and the private ceremony felt like distant echoes now. The city's vibrant life seemed to fade into the background, and all that remained was the soft hum of the engine and the silence between mother and son. Calvin sat in the passenger seat, his hands resting loosely on his lap, but his mind was far from relaxed. He had witnessed something today that was hard to fully comprehend. His mother's strength was something he had always admired, but today he saw it in a new light. The way she had handled the situation with Jeremy, so calmly, so composed, left him both in awe and in thought. She had not reacted with anger or bitterness. She had not raised her voice in frustration or demanded anything from anyone. She had simply stood her ground, chosen to forgive, and walked away with grace as they passed familiar streets. Calvin couldn't help but reflect on everything that had unfolded. He had expected his mother to fight back, to demand justice in a way that matched the emotional storm of the situation. But what he saw was different. Clara didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to win in the traditional sense. Her victory was quiet, unspoken, and yet so much more powerful than anything he could have imagined. "Mama," he finally spoke, his voice thoughtful. "You didn't let it get to you today. You didn't let him or any of it affect you. How do you do that?" Clara glanced over at him, her gaze soft but steady. The quiet hum of the road filled the space between them before she answered. "It's not about ignoring the hurt, Calvin. It's not about pretending the world is perfect. But it's about choosing how you respond to it. If I'd let that moment consume me, if I'd allowed anger and frustration to take over, then I would have lost something far more valuable than any apology or recognition. I would have lost my peace." Calvin nodded slowly, trying to absorb her words. He understood what she was saying, but it still felt like a difficult lesson to fully grasp. How could someone simply let go of the hurt, especially when it came from something so personal, so disrespectful? It seemed almost impossible. And yet, there she was, his mother, who had endured so much in her life, who had fought against a world that often rejected her, doing just that. She had chosen to let go. Clara continued, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "It's a choice, Calvin. Every day we make choices, how we treat others, how we react, how we carry ourselves in the face of adversity. It's easy to fight with anger, to lash out, to demand justice. But real change doesn't come from big victories or dramatic confrontations. It comes from the small, everyday decisions we make to live with respect and compassion." She paused, her gaze turning back to the road ahead, the faint glow of the streetlights casting shadows across her face. "You can change the world by how you treat people, by showing kindness even when it's difficult. You can teach people what respect looks like by living it yourself, not through what you say, but through what you do. That's the kind of change that lasts. That's the kind of change that ripples out into the world." Calvin sat in silence, reflecting on his mother's words. The weight of her lesson settled on him like a warm, heavy blanket. He had always thought that change came from making a big impact, from standing up and shouting for what was right. He had always thought that to be seen, to be heard, he needed to demand attention, to make noise. But now, he saw his mother's quiet strength, her ability to make a profound impact without raising her voice. It was a lesson that humbled him. "I get it now, Mama," he said quietly, his voice filled with a sense of clarity. "It's not about being loud. It's about being steady, about choosing kindness no matter what. That's what really makes a difference, right?" Clara smiled, a small, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "Exactly. The world will always have its challenges, Calvin. There will always be people who try to tear you down, who will judge you for things beyond your control. But you have the power to choose how you react to them. And if you choose to react with kindness, with patience, with respect, you'll change the way the world sees you. And, more importantly, you'll change the way the world treats others." The car turned onto a familiar street, and as they neared home, Calvin felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had learned something invaluable today, not just about his mother, but about life. The world was full of noise, full of conflict, full of moments that could easily drag a person down. But the true measure of strength, he realized, was in how one responded to those moments. The real victory wasn't in fighting back with anger, but in choosing to rise above, to meet each challenge with patience and grace as they pulled into the driveway. Clara turned to her son, her eyes warm with affection. "You know, Calvin, we don't have to wait for the world to change for us to live the life we want. We make our own changes every single day through the way we live, through the way we treat others. And that's how we create the world we want to see." Calvin smiled, feeling a sense of calm settle within him. The lesson his mother had taught him wasn't just a lesson for today. It was a lesson for life. And as he stepped out of the car, he knew that he would carry this lesson with him, not just in his thoughts, but in his actions. The small daily decisions, the quiet moments of kindness, the moments when no one is watching. Those were the moments that truly mattered. And with that, as the door closed behind them, Calvin felt something shift inside him. A new sense of purpose, a new way of seeing the world. Because sometimes, the greatest change doesn't come from the loudest actions, but from the quietest decisions to be kind, to be patient, and to treat others with the respect they deserve. If you've enjoyed this story and the powerful lessons it offers, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories and thought-provoking content. Let's continue to learn from each other and grow together. See you in the next video.